Welcome back to Season 2 of the GAPcast. My name is Guillermo, here to provide you with a neuroscientific perspective on pop psychology, here with my co-hosts.
Hello, I'm Abraham. I'm eating.
My name is Peter, and I'll be providing pop psychology.
All right, so topic of our conversation today is implicit bias. In wake of the many protests and conversations about systemic racism, I thought it would be great to talk about the implicit side of this. You know, those little biases that you don't know that you have, but they may be secretly impacting your behavior. So let's talk about this. Peter, what do you have?
Well, to start off, you actually want to find out how exactly you are implicitly biased. First, you can go to implicit.harvard.edu. To repeat that, that is implicit.harvard.edu. And that is a Harvard-based test that can tell you exactly what kind of biases you have in your life. Now, this does not, of course, mean that you are immediately racist or that you have any strong prejudices by yourself. But we all have different kinds of biases, which is why, once again, they're implicit, based on our own surroundings, based on how we were raised, based on our own social circles, education, so on and so forth. So it's okay to have some of them, but just to understand that you have them and not to act on them.
Exactly. So, implicit bias is not racism. They're just things that might influence behavior. So, a study found that there are two things that come into play when you're implementing implicit bias. There's stereotype activation. So, when you first think of a stereotype, when you encounter a person from an out group, which is somebody that's different from you, and there's a stereotype application. That's when you apply that stereotype into your judgments and behaviors. So just because you think of it doesn't mean that it will go into application. Studies have found that if you're able to increase the distance or the duration of time between the two events, you're less likely to let that bias affect your behavior. So when you first think of these biases, let some time to sit on it, so that way it doesn't necessarily affect your behavior.
To elaborate further onto what exactly implicit bias is, implicit biasism isn't, once again, racism, where you just have an absolute hatred towards this one person. It could be something as simple as if you see someone, for example, wearing a hoodie, and you just do not trust that. You just grew up in an area where people wearing hoodies is always generally a sign of a bad thing. So kind of like Pavlov's dogs, you were trained to be aware of those kind of people. So now in the future, though you see someone and he has posed no threat to you, he has done nothing to alarm you, he has not threatened you, has not done anything to scare you, you still decide to walk on the other side of the street just because he's wearing a hoodie. And you are not aware of that. Because according to Vox.com, implicit biases come from the messages, attitudes, and stereotypes we pick up from the world we live in. And research over time and from different countries shows that it tends to line up with general social hierarchies.
Yeah. So the stereotypes that we have, they're usually only for people that are different than us, because you know, if you're in a group, you know that the stereotypes are not true. But if you don't belong to another group, well, you just won't be able to know, right? So then it comes into play something called intergroup bias, and that's the perception that one's own social group is superior to others. And this is usually due just to a group competition, right? You want to feel that your group of friends, that the people you hang with, you know, that they're good people, and that and the reason you're with them is because they're better than other people. And that is when you get problematic behavior. So I was going to say that that's why it's so important to be able to have classes so we're aware of that. So a study found that if you're able to give people an online diversity program, and if they have a motivation to control their prejudices, the program will be effective. However, this is what I found interesting. If the avatar is the same race, like the teacher that's teaching the class is the same race as you, you're more likely to be less motivated to reduce prejudice. But if the avatar is the opposite race, you actually are more motivated to reduce your prejudice. So it's believed that seeing somebody from an opposite group gives you kind of a bit of guilt. You're basically like, oh man, if I don't address my biases, then then I'm doing a disservice. But if they're in the same group, it just gives you guilt and you don't feel pressured to do it. So that's why if these classes, it's important to have an avatar that is an opposite race of the participant.
Oddly enough, people also tend to have biases against people of their own group. In other words, it's called in-group biased. Now, it does show that we do show a bit of biases towards our own kind of people. So white Americans do have biases against other races, even though we're all in the same country. But racial minorities also have biases against their own people as well. In other words, minorities can be racist against other minorities. This is especially found in the Latino community, in which I can speak in behalf of.
Fake news.
No, no, actually it's not. Latinos do have this kind of prejudice. it is possible for people to be racist against their own kind.
Yes, so that is true. In Mexico, there's an unfortunate tendency to discriminate against people that are of darker color. I don't know if this isn't my experience, but from what I've heard is that this happens in African American culture too. They tend to whitewash African Americans, and the darker ones tend to be a bit outgrouped as opposed to the lighter African Americans. So there's a whole host of problems with that. So yes, it is for sure. It is possible to be maybe racist, maybe biased against your own race.
Going back to the Latinos, you said Mexicans prefer to have light skin. That was also such a beauty standard. So would that still be considered an implicit biasism if it's simply held of beauty? In other words, people who have, for example, back then, people who were fatter meant they ate more, therefore they had more money, therefore they're more attractive. Nowadays, in Mexico, if they're whiter, it means they don't have to go to the sun that often, therefore they're not labor workers, but rather office job workers. So therefore they have more money, and therefore money rules everything. But is it still considered an implicit bias?
It depends on if it affects your behavior. So, for instance, if it's just the beauty standard that it's like, for instance, I find him more attractive, not necessarily. But if it's something that changes your perspective on this, for instance, because they're light skinned, they must be rich, right? Or because they're light skinned, they must be successful. That is an implicit bias.
Oh.
So it just depends on what's happening. We all have preferences in terms of attraction, right? But when it comes to does their face, does their appearance change how you perceive them? Yes, that is a bias.
Well, in that case, elaborating with Fox, research has also shown that it does affect the healthcare industry, which is something which is very pertinent right now while we're in the COVID-19. You see, in one study, despite the self-reporting with very little explicit bias, 2 out of 3 clinicians were found to harbor implicit bias against Blacks and Latinos, minorities, which are currently being hit the hardest during this pandemic. But yeah, and they say it can be connected to racial discrimination in hiring, performance evaluations, house discriminations, and even perceptions of neighborhood crime. In other words, if you look into poorer neighborhoods in your own city, you will notice that a lot of the poor neighborhoods tend to be full of minorities. And once again, this can be part of systemic racism, which they do not have the opportunity to get out of those kind of low-income neighborhoods. But we're right now just focusing on implicit biasism. Anything to add?
Let's talk
Yeah,
about the
so-
Karens.
Would it be considered implicit biasism if they do not fall into any kind of category, but rather one of their own likings? In other words, that's it. Can you be implicitly biased towards people who like heavy metal?
Yes, you can.
And same thing with Karens.
A bias is anything that you use to judge a person based off of their mere appearance or something that they associate with, rather than getting to know the person. So it could be anything. It could, for instance, the Karen whole thing could be a simple haircut. If they have that haircut, you automatically associate them with being a quote unquote Karen. That's an implicit bias.
All right. Now, according to
So-
Ohio State University, other research explored the connection with criminal sentencing and Afrocentric feature bias, which refers to the general negative judgments and beliefs that many people hold regarding individuals who possess Afrocentric features such as dark skin, a wide nose, and full lips. Now, with controlling numerous factors, individuals with most prominent Afrocentric features receive longer sentences than their other counterparts, in other words, white people.
And this is a perfect example of systemic racism in the sense that it's not necessarily they're targeting a person directly because of their skin color, but rather implicitly the way they're viewing the person is changing the sentencing. And studies have shown that African Americans are sentenced more strictly than white people, even in the same crime and the same history. So this is an example of how implicit bias can actually be really, really detrimental because you're determining a person's life as a judge, right? So can you imagine how important it is to moderate your implicit bias in these situations that, just because he's black doesn't mean that we're going to give him a worse sentence?
It can be very detrimental, especially during very crucial life and death situations. In other In other words, the reason why you see it more commonly in police officers is because they do not have time to exactly get to know the other individual while there's a crime happening or while there's being very high stakes situations, because every second matters. And if you take too long to respond, you could cost you your life or even worse, other people's lives. Sadly, this could also result to even darker judgments, which could lead to a lot of fatal results.
Exactly why implicit bias training is so important with the police. So this goes back to that study that I mentioned earlier. The longer gap of time you have between stereotype activation and stereotype application, the less likely you are to implement that stereotype. But when cops, they don't have split-second decisions. They don't have time to remove their stereotypes. They're just going to act, which is why it's so important to train them before they go into the situation to say, it's okay, we all have these biases, but you have to understand that the biases aren't true. You have to judge a situation based on the context, not necessarily the person's skin color or the person's appearance. You have to judge based on their behavior, and that's why it's so important to train these officers and not to make them train just to shoot on sight.
No, it depends on the situation all the time. But yeah, you should go after of what the person is at their core, but
And not just their
not not
appearance.
not not just their appearance, but obviously if they got a gun and it's pointing at you,
Of course, yeah,
do something.
that's different. That's defendable, right? Like you're just defending yourself. But in a situation where you just shoot because the person is a darker skin color and you wouldn't shoot if they were a lighter skin color, that is implicit bias at work.
But then that would require you to shoot two people.
I meant in the context of a situation, like for instance, if in one situation the guy was white and the other situation the guy was black, but you only shoot when the guy is black, that's an implicit bias. Or it could even be full-blown racism. You never know sometimes.
Well, in that case, I wanted to elaborate on actually, I want to elaborate on 8 tactics to help identify and reduce your implicit biases. And this can be found in the website of aafp.org, since it's very difficult to actually identify it when you have an implicit bias because it's in the name, implicit. So you don't genuinely understand yourself when you're doing certain actions. You have to really step out of your own self-observation in order to truly understand whether or not what you're doing is wrong. Because, well, for some people, you've been doing it your entire life, so there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Now, the first one will be introspection, where to identify your own prejudices and take implicit association tests. In other words, this is relating right back to the Harvard implicit test. First, it's better to understand yourself. Like Sun Tzu says, know your enemy, know yourself. By doing so, not only are you able to identify the problem, but you also find ways to help you better tackle the problem when encountered by it. The next one is going to be mindfulness. Now, you're most likely to give it to your biases because, like I said before, they're implicit, especially during high stakes situations. Now, it's always good to help focus on breathing and helping to help reduce stress whenever something's happening that may require you to make a very fast-paced decision that could also lead to harsher results. Anything else you want to add? You guys can interrupt me, but whenever you want.
Yes, I was going to say that the mindfulness training is really good because it allows your mind to be able to stay in the moment and not go on like, what if this happens? Or like, oh my God, instead you're just looking at the situation at hand. This is especially important for police officers. You don't want to think too far in the future. You just want to say, this is what's happening right now and this is what I'm going to address.
All right, yes. And the next one's going to be perspective taking. Now, this is not obviously going to be happening every time you have to encounter a situation, but always try to have empathy and try to relate to the other individual being stereotyped. For example, this is especially prominent when you yourself have been stereotyped and you see how people treat you differently. In other words, if you're a minority, if you go to a northern state, personally, going to Kentucky, you can see how differently they treat you, and it can really help you empathize whenever you see somebody you might not really trust yourself. Other things would learn, remember try and learn to slow down. Before you start interacting with other individuals, pause and reduce any reflective actions. In other words, do not just write things on impulse. Try to think about your decisions and think about the consequences of each decision. Now that's a basic, obvious answer to most actions you have to take regardless, but this time you have to take into consideration whether or not it is natural under the social norm. And then those other things will be called individualism, individualization, Evaluate people's bias based on their personal characteristics rather than those affiliated with their group. Take the time to understand somebody. Take the time to make friends with them. If you're, let's say, in a common settings, a work environment, a school settings, or maybe in everyday life, where you have to constantly interact with the same kind of people, then make sure to at least first get to know them before immediately judging them and dividing yourself amongst them. Because if you do that, that will only reinforce negative stereotypes within yourself. Next, check your messaging. Constantly try to phrase your languages to not constantly put divisions within yourself. I believe it was Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman, if I'm not mistaken, said he does not really support or like the idea of Black History Month. Why? Because it's stupid. You're not only identifying the fact that there is a Black History Month, that there has been those prejudices in contrast to moving forward from them, but rather constantly divide yourself in color.
Instead of saying Black History Month, why not just it's just American history? You don't get all that history just dedicated to a month. I mean, it is just a part of history.
It's every month should be Black History Month.
Yes, that is true, but I think this also boils down to the whole Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter debate. We know all lives matter, but the thing is, we want to make sure that Black lives matter too, right? That this is the group that's being targeted, and this is the group that we have to help. Same thing with Black History Month. We know that we should study Black history, but if we don't ever dedicate a time to studying Black history, would we ever do it? That's the thing. So I guess that's the intention behind it. Yes, we should always be aware of it, but we should set some time aside to understand it.
And once again, this actually may be to personal preferences. I myself am a bit analytical when it comes to these kind of situations. Other people have different perspectives on this. Now, it's called institutionalized fairness. In other words, I believe I see this as affirmative action. In an institution, if you're given the opportunity to hire two exact individuals, one's of white descendants, the other one's of Black descendants, you should pick the Black descendants, one, not only for his cultural differences and the diversification, but two, because of affirmative action. Now, this will help.
It's affirmative action, though.
Affirmative action is taking preference over minorities because we want to not only one make up for all the shit we made them go through. The other thing about affirmative action is that it's supposed to help minorities get out of any terrible situations they're in right now. You see, systemic racism boils it down to the reason why Black people are not really accepted into jobs as white people isn't because all Black people are stupid or because businesses are racist. It's stupid for a business to be racist. They care about money, not people. So, but a lot of Black people do not have the same education level because they do not have the same income level. The reason they don't have the same income level is because their jobs are not as great as white individuals. And the reason because it's so is because they do not have the right education level. And it's a complete negative cycle from there.
Yeah. So pretty much the system sets them up to be screwed, and affirmative action is making up for the system screwing them over.
And that is where institutionalized fairness kicks in. It's sort of affirmative action. It's supposed to be helping them out to the point where we will no longer need to have affirmative action ever again. The reason we do this is so we never have to do it again.
Exactly.
And finally, it's take two. Try resisting implicit biasism and always try to find different ways to keep moving forward from it. In other words, if you constantly find yourself just sitting somewhere else because you don't want to be sitting with X, Y, Z types of people, then take a chance, sit with them, and try to make it into a habit. Maybe you don't have to enjoy the people, but at least do not try to exclude them. Do not try to be refraining from them. Do not divide yourself.
So, from what I get from all this is, okay, affirmative action is, okay, I'm sorry. It's not just choosing them, their skills. It's also choosing them because of their race.
Yes. So affirmative action, like think of a college admissions board, right? And they have to choose between two people of identical skill sets, a white guy and a person and a Black person. Affirmative action lets the admissions board choose the Black guy over the white guy because one, they have to make sure that their campus is diverse, and two, because systemically Black people have to work harder to get to the same level as a white guy because the deck is basically stacked against them. This isn't true for everybody because some people are born into wealth, but in a lot of cases it is true. And so to make up for that systemic injustice, affirmative action lets the college board help the Black person out by picking him.
Oh, okay.
It does sound like reverse racism, but we have to think of it this way: that we do what we do because the alternative would be worse. If we continue
Hmm.
to let this negative cycle go on, then our children and our children's children will continue to live in a world where prejudices exist. We are doing this so they won't have to.
Exactly. If we let the alternative keep happening, campuses would just be filled with a lot of Caucasian people because, statistically speaking, they have access to better resources than minorities, and they're able to study better, they're able to get better grades, So it's just to help out the system that has basically set the deck against these minorities. And thank you, everybody, for joining us on our conversations about implicit bias, race, and many other interesting topics. It's important to discuss these things in times of unrest and concern about systemic racism, because without it, if we don't have an educated opinion, then the opinion doesn't matter at all, right? So I'm Guillermo.
I'm Abraham.
My name is Peter, and thank you for you guys for joining us.
We'll catch you next time. Bye.
See
Bye.
you
Bye
later.
bye.